I woke up. I woke up.
Me desperté.
I woke up.
I woke up.
She stood there. She stood there.
Ella se paró allí.
She stood there.
She stood there.
He stayed calm. He stayed calm.
Él se mantuvo calmado.
He stayed calm.
He stayed calm.
We left early. We left early.
Salimos temprano.
We left early.
We left early.
They came back. They came back.
Ellos regresaron.
They came back.
They came back.
I heard that. I heard that.
Lo escuché.
I heard that.
I heard that.
She sat down. She sat down.
Ella se sentó.
She sat down.
She sat down.
He got ready. He got ready.
Él se preparó.
He got ready.
He got ready.
We ran home. We ran home.
Corrimos a casa.
We ran home.
We ran home.
They felt cold. They felt cold.
Ellos sintieron frío.
They felt cold.
They felt cold.
I wrote it. I wrote it.
Lo escribí.
I wrote it.
I wrote it.
She ate quickly. She ate quickly.
Ella comió rápido.
She ate quickly.
She ate quickly.
He drove fast. He drove fast.
Él condujo rápido.
He drove fast.
He drove fast.
We spoke little. We spoke little.
Hablamos poco.
We spoke little.
We spoke little.
They worked late. They worked late.
Trabajaron hasta tarde.
They worked late.
They worked late.
I lost it. I lost it.
Lo perdí.
I lost it.
I lost it.
She fell asleep. She fell asleep.
Ella se quedó dormida.
She fell asleep.
She fell asleep.
He stood tall. He stood tall.
Él se mantuvo erguido.
He stood tall.
He stood tall.
We kept going. We kept going.
Seguimos adelante.
We kept going.
We kept going.
They turned back. They turned back.
Ellos regresaron.
They turned back.
They turned back.
I found it. I found it.
Lo encontré.
I found it.
I found it.
She opened it. She opened it.
Ella lo abrió.
She opened it.
She opened it.
He shut it. He shut it.
Él lo cerró.
He shut it.
He shut it.
We built it. We built it.
Lo construimos.
We built it.
We built it.
They broke it. They broke it.
Ellos lo rompieron.
They broke it.
They broke it.
I fixed it. I fixed it.
Lo arreglé.
I fixed it.
I fixed it.
She drew something. She drew something.
Ella dibujó algo.
She drew something.
She drew something.
He sang softly. He sang softly.
Él cantó suavemente.
He sang softly.
He sang softly.
We danced well. We danced well.
Bailamos bien.
We danced well.
We danced well.
They looked away. They looked away.
Ellos miraron hacia otro lado.
They looked away.
They looked away.
I watched closely. I watched closely.
Observé de cerca.
I watched closely.
I watched closely.
She moved fast. She moved fast.
Ella se movió rápido.
She moved fast.
She moved fast.
He stopped suddenly. He stopped suddenly.
Él se detuvo de repente.
He stopped suddenly.
He stopped suddenly.
We waited there. We waited there.
Esperamos allí.
We waited there.
We waited there.
They rested here. They rested here.
Ellos descansaron aquí.
They rested here.
They rested here.
I tried again. I tried again.
Lo intenté de nuevo.
I tried again.
I tried again.
She felt better. She felt better.
Ella se sintió mejor.
She felt better.
She felt better.
He stayed longer. He stayed longer.
Él se quedó más tiempo.
He stayed longer.
He stayed longer.
We helped out. We helped out.
Ayudamos.
We helped out.
We helped out.
They laughed hard. They laughed hard.
Ellos rieron fuerte.
They laughed hard.
They laughed hard.
I learned fast. I learned fast.
Aprendí rápido.
I learned fast.
I learned fast.
She read aloud. She read aloud.
Ella leyó en voz alta.
She read aloud.
She read aloud.
He counted quickly. He counted quickly.
Él contó rápido.
He counted quickly.
He counted quickly.
We chose wisely. We chose wisely.
Elegimos sabiamente.
We chose wisely.
We chose wisely.
They agreed quickly. They agreed quickly.
Ellos estuvieron de acuerdo rápidamente.
They agreed quickly.
They agreed quickly.
I grew tired. I grew tired.
Me cansé.
I grew tired.
I grew tired.
She missed it. She missed it.
Ella lo extrañó.
She missed it.
She missed it.
He joined late. He joined late.
Él se unió tarde.
He joined late.
He joined late.
We improved greatly. We improved greatly.
Mejoramos mucho.
We improved greatly.
We improved greatly.
They shared everything. They shared everything.
Ellos compartieron todo.
They shared everything.
They shared everything.
I forgot that. I forgot that.
Lo olvidé.
I forgot that.
I forgot that.
She cleaned more. She cleaned more.
Ella limpió más.
She cleaned more.
She cleaned more.
He planned ahead. He planned ahead.
Él planeó con anticipación.
He planned ahead.
He planned ahead.
We waited patiently. We waited patiently.
Esperamos pacientemente.
We waited patiently.
We waited patiently.
They left suddenly. They left suddenly.
Ellos se fueron de repente.
They left suddenly.
They left suddenly.
I saved it. I saved it.
Lo guardé.
I saved it.
I saved it.
She watched TV. She watched TV.
Ella vio televisión.
She watched TV.
She watched TV.
He washed clothes. He washed clothes.
Él lavó ropa.
He washed clothes.
He washed clothes.
We parked outside. We parked outside.
Estacionamos afuera.
We parked outside.
We parked outside.
They started early. They started early.
Ellos comenzaron temprano.
They started early.
They started early.
I drove home. I drove home.
Conduje a casa.
I drove home.
I drove home.
She called back. She called back.
Ella devolvió la llamada.
She called back.
She called back.
He sent help. He sent help.
Él envió ayuda.
He sent help.
He sent help.
We ran faster. We ran faster.
Corrimos más rápido.
We ran faster.
We ran faster.
They stopped quickly. They stopped quickly.
Ellos se detuvieron rápido.
They stopped quickly.
They stopped quickly.
I sang softly. I sang softly.
Canté suavemente.
I sang softly.
I sang softly.
She painted walls. She painted walls.
Ella pintó paredes.
She painted walls.
She painted walls.
He listened closely. He listened closely.
Él escuchó de cerca.
He listened closely.
He listened closely.
We cooked together. We cooked together.
Cocinamos juntos.
We cooked together.
We cooked together.
They smiled back. They smiled back.
Ellos sonrieron de vuelta.
They smiled back.
They smiled back.
I prepared food. I prepared food.
Preparé comida.
I prepared food.
I prepared food.
She hugged tightly. She hugged tightly.
Ella abrazó con fuerza.
She hugged tightly.
She hugged tightly.
He waited quietly. He waited quietly.
Él esperó en silencio.
He waited quietly.
He waited quietly.
We talked calmly. We talked calmly.
Hablamos con calma.
We talked calmly.
We talked calmly.
They responded quickly. They responded quickly.
Ellos respondieron rápido.
They responded quickly.
They responded quickly.
I stayed quiet. I stayed quiet.
Me quedé callado.
I stayed quiet.
I stayed quiet.
She cared deeply. She cared deeply.
Ella se preocupó profundamente.
She cared deeply.
She cared deeply.
He left quickly. He left quickly.
Él se fue rápido.
He left quickly.
He left quickly.
We walked slowly. We walked slowly.
Caminamos despacio.
We walked slowly.
We walked slowly.
They arrived late. They arrived late.
Ellos llegaron tarde.
They arrived late.
They arrived late.
I believed him. I believed him.
Le creí a él.
I believed him.
I believed him.
She loved more. She loved more.
Ella amó más.
She loved more.
She loved more.
He studied hard. He studied hard.
Él estudió mucho.
He studied hard.
He studied hard.
We practiced daily. We practiced daily.
Practicamos diariamente.
We practiced daily.
We practiced daily.
They admired that. They admired that.
Ellos admiraron eso.
They admired that.
They admired that.
I observed quietly. I observed quietly.
Observé en silencio.
I observed quietly.
I observed quietly.
She remembered clearly. She remembered clearly.
Ella recordó claramente.
She remembered clearly.
She remembered clearly.
He cleaned carefully. He cleaned carefully.
Él limpió cuidadosamente.
He cleaned carefully.
He cleaned carefully.
We explored outside. We explored outside.
Exploramos afuera.
We explored outside.
We explored outside.
They played hard. They played hard.
Jugaron duro.
They played hard.
They played hard.
I asked something. I asked something.
Pregunté algo.
I asked something.
I asked something.
She gave everything. She gave everything.
Ella dio todo.
She gave everything.
She gave everything.
He repaired it. He repaired it.
Él lo reparó.
He repaired it.
He repaired it.
We rested fully. We rested fully.
Descansamos completamente.
We rested fully.
We rested fully.
They learned quickly. They learned quickly.
Aprendieron rápido.
They learned quickly.
They learned quickly.
I shouted loudly. I shouted loudly.
Grité fuerte.
I shouted loudly.
I shouted loudly.
She reached out. She reached out.
Ella se acercó.
She reached out.
She reached out.
He fell hard. He fell hard.
Él cayó fuerte.
He fell hard.
He fell hard.
We understood that. We understood that.
Entendimos eso.
We understood that.
We understood that.
They improved rapidly. They improved rapidly.
Mejoraron rápido.
They improved rapidly.
They improved rapidly.
I called earlier. I called earlier.
Llamé más temprano.
I called earlier.
I called earlier.
She walked faster. She walked faster.
Ella caminó más rápido.
She walked faster.
She walked faster.
He drove carefully. He drove carefully.
Él condujo cuidadosamente.
He drove carefully.
He drove carefully.
We tried harder. We tried harder.
Lo intentamos más.
We tried harder.
We tried harder.
They smiled softly. They smiled softly.
Ellos sonrieron suavemente.
They smiled softly.
They smiled softly.
I stayed longer. I stayed longer.
Me quedé más tiempo.
I stayed longer.
I stayed longer.
She agreed quickly. She agreed quickly.
Ella estuvo de acuerdo rápido.
She agreed quickly.
She agreed quickly.
He answered firmly. He answered firmly.
Él respondió firmemente.
He answered firmly.
He answered firmly.
We discussed openly. We discussed openly.
Discutimos abiertamente.
We discussed openly.
We discussed openly.
They arrived early. They arrived early.
Ellos llegaron temprano.
They arrived early.
They arrived early.
I prepared ahead. I prepared ahead.
Me preparé con anticipación.
I prepared ahead.
I prepared ahead.
She cooked better. She cooked better.
Ella cocinó mejor.
She cooked better.
She cooked better.
He danced gracefully. He danced gracefully.
Él bailó con gracia.
He danced gracefully.
He danced gracefully.
We spoke kindly. We spoke kindly.
Hablamos amablemente.
We spoke kindly.
We spoke kindly.
They cleaned thoroughly. They cleaned thoroughly.
Limpiaron completamente.
They cleaned thoroughly.
They cleaned thoroughly.
I parked properly. I parked properly.
Estacioné correctamente.
I parked properly.
I parked properly.
She responded calmly. She responded calmly.
Ella respondió con calma.
She responded calmly.
She responded calmly.
He hugged warmly. He hugged warmly.
Él abrazó calurosamente.
He hugged warmly.
He hugged warmly.
We worked harder. We worked harder.
Trabajamos más duro.
We worked harder.
We worked harder.
They rested fully. They rested fully.
Descansaron completamente.
They rested fully.
They rested fully.
I understood better. I understood better.
Entendí mejor.
I understood better.
I understood better.
She forgot completely. She forgot completely.
Ella lo olvidó completamente.
She forgot completely.
She forgot completely.
He apologized sincerely. He apologized sincerely.
Él se disculpó sinceramente.
He apologized sincerely.
He apologized sincerely.
We observed closely. We observed closely.
Observamos de cerca.
We observed closely.
We observed closely.
They smiled brightly. They smiled brightly.
Sonrieron brillantemente.
They smiled brightly.
They smiled brightly.
I cooked quickly. I cooked quickly.
Cociné rápido.
I cooked quickly.
I cooked quickly.
She saved everything. She saved everything.
Ella guardó todo.
She saved everything.
She saved everything.
He explained briefly. He explained briefly.
Él explicó brevemente.
He explained briefly.
He explained briefly.
We painted together. We painted together.
Pintamos juntos.
We painted together.
We painted together.
They waited quietly. They waited quietly.
Esperaron en silencio.
They waited quietly.
They waited quietly.
I read quietly. I read quietly.
Leí en silencio.
I read quietly.
I read quietly.
She studied harder. She studied harder.
Ella estudió más.
She studied harder.
She studied harder.
He worked diligently. He worked diligently.
Él trabajó diligentemente.
He worked diligently.
He worked diligently.
We cleaned properly. We cleaned properly.
Limpiamos correctamente.
We cleaned properly.
We cleaned properly.
They built carefully. They built carefully.
Construyeron cuidadosamente.
They built carefully.
They built carefully.
I stopped briefly. I stopped briefly.
Me detuve brevemente.
I stopped briefly.
I stopped briefly.
She danced beautifully. She danced beautifully.
Ella bailó hermosamente.
She danced beautifully.
She danced beautifully.
He called yesterday. He called yesterday.
Él llamó ayer.
He called yesterday.
He called yesterday.
We stayed nearby. We stayed nearby.
Nos quedamos cerca.
We stayed nearby.
We stayed nearby.
They enjoyed themselves. They enjoyed themselves.
Ellos se divirtieron.
They enjoyed themselves.
They enjoyed themselves.
I planned ahead. I planned ahead.
Planeé con anticipación.
I planned ahead.
I planned ahead.
She wrote clearly. She wrote clearly.
Ella escribió claramente.
She wrote clearly.
She wrote clearly.
He improved slowly. He improved slowly.
Él mejoró lentamente.
He improved slowly.
He improved slowly.
We waited longer. We waited longer.
Esperamos más.
We waited longer.
We waited longer.
They laughed loudly. They laughed loudly.
Ellos rieron fuerte.
They laughed loudly.
They laughed loudly.
I helped gladly. I helped gladly.
Ayudé con gusto.
I helped gladly.
I helped gladly.
She hugged softly. She hugged softly.
Ella abrazó suavemente.
She hugged softly.
She hugged softly.
He smiled gently. He smiled gently.
Él sonrió gentilmente.
He smiled gently.
He smiled gently.
We learned faster. We learned faster.
Aprendimos más rápido.
We learned faster.
We learned faster.
They traveled often. They traveled often.
Ellos viajaron seguido.
They traveled often.
They traveled often.
I drove slowly. I drove slowly.
Conduje despacio.
I drove slowly.
I drove slowly.
She called again. She called again.
Ella llamó de nuevo.
She called again.
She called again.
He played harder. He played harder.
Él jugó más fuerte.
He played harder.
He played harder.
We rested more. We rested more.
Descansamos más.
We rested more.
We rested more.
They worked together. They worked together.
Trabajaron juntos.
They worked together.
They worked together.
I painted more. I painted more.
Pinté más.
I painted more.
I painted more.
She tried harder. She tried harder.
Ella intentó más fuerte.
She tried harder.
She tried harder.
He stayed close. He stayed close.
Él se quedó cerca.
He stayed close.
He stayed close.
We observed further. We observed further.
Observamos más.
We observed further.
We observed further.
They understood deeply. They understood deeply.
Ellos entendieron profundamente.
They understood deeply.
They understood deeply.
I waited calmly. I waited calmly.
Esperé con calma.
I waited calmly.
I waited calmly.
She cared quietly. She cared quietly.
Ella se preocupó en silencio.
She cared quietly.
She cared quietly.
He hugged tightly. He hugged tightly.
Él abrazó con fuerza.
He hugged tightly.
He hugged tightly.
We ran quickly. We ran quickly.
Corrimos rápido.
We ran quickly.
We ran quickly.
They listened carefully. They listened carefully.
Escucharon atentamente.
They listened carefully.
They listened carefully.
I smiled briefly. I smiled briefly.
Sonreí brevemente.
I smiled briefly.
I smiled briefly.
She stopped early. She stopped early.
Ella se detuvo temprano.
She stopped early.
She stopped early.
He arrived late. He arrived late.
Él llegó tarde.
He arrived late.
He arrived late.
We walked together. We walked together.
Caminamos juntos.
We walked together.
We walked together.
They looked around. They looked around.
Miraron alrededor.
They looked around.
They looked around.
I shared openly. I shared openly.
Compartí abiertamente.
I shared openly.
I shared openly.
She explained slowly. She explained slowly.
Ella explicó lentamente.
She explained slowly.
She explained slowly.
He responded quickly. He responded quickly.
Él respondió rápido.
He responded quickly.
He responded quickly.
We hugged warmly. We hugged warmly.
Abrazamos calurosamente.
We hugged warmly.
We hugged warmly.
They answered honestly. They answered honestly.
Ellos respondieron honestamente.
They answered honestly.
They answered honestly.
I worked early. I worked early.
Trabajé temprano.
I worked early.
I worked early.
She listened closely. She listened closely.
Ella escuchó de cerca.
She listened closely.
She listened closely.
He laughed softly. He laughed softly.
Él rió suavemente.
He laughed softly.
He laughed softly.
We prepared dinner. We prepared dinner.
Preparamos la cena.
We prepared dinner.
We prepared dinner.
They waited nearby. They waited nearby.
Ellos esperaron cerca.
They waited nearby.
They waited nearby.
I danced gracefully. I danced gracefully.
Bailé con gracia.
I danced gracefully.
I danced gracefully.
She sang quietly. She sang quietly.
Ella cantó en silencio.
She sang quietly.
She sang quietly.
He painted beautifully. He painted beautifully.
Él pintó hermosamente.
He painted beautifully.
He painted beautifully.
We traveled safely. We traveled safely.
Viajamos seguros.
We traveled safely.
We traveled safely.
They played softly. They played softly.
Ellos jugaron suavemente.
They played softly.
They played softly.
I observed everything. I observed everything.
Observé todo.
I observed everything.
I observed everything.
She explained clearly. She explained clearly.
Ella explicó claramente.
She explained clearly.
She explained clearly.
He cooked deliciously. He cooked deliciously.
Él cocinó deliciosamente.
He cooked deliciously.
He cooked deliciously.
We helped others. We helped others.
Ayudamos a otros.
We helped others.
We helped others.
They rested peacefully. They rested peacefully.
Descansaron en paz.
They rested peacefully.
They rested peacefully.
I cleaned yesterday. I cleaned yesterday.
Limpié ayer.
I cleaned yesterday.
I cleaned yesterday.
She studied deeply. She studied deeply.
Ella estudió profundamente.
She studied deeply.
She studied deeply.
He drove slowly. He drove slowly.
Él condujo despacio.
He drove slowly.
He drove slowly.
We ran further. We ran further.
Corrimos más lejos.
We ran further.
We ran further.
They stayed briefly. They stayed briefly.
Se quedaron brevemente.
They stayed briefly.
They stayed briefly.
I forgot quickly. I forgot quickly.
Lo olvidé rápido.
I forgot quickly.
I forgot quickly.
She hugged gently. She hugged gently.
Ella abrazó gentilmente.
She hugged gently.
She hugged gently.
He responded warmly. He responded warmly.
Él respondió calurosamente.
He responded warmly.
He responded warmly.
We walked quickly. We walked quickly.
Caminamos rápido.
We walked quickly.
We walked quickly.
They traveled far. They traveled far.
Viajaron lejos.
They traveled far.
They traveled far.
I smiled kindly. I smiled kindly.
Sonreí amablemente.
I smiled kindly.
I smiled kindly.
She arrived early. She arrived early.
Ella llegó temprano.
She arrived early.
She arrived early.
He hugged softly. He hugged softly.
Él abrazó suavemente.
He hugged softly.
He hugged softly.
We sang loudly. We sang loudly.
Cantamos fuerte.
We sang loudly.
We sang loudly.
They waited longer. They waited longer.
Esperaron más tiempo.
They waited longer.
They waited longer.
I studied harder. I studied harder.
Estudié más.
I studied harder.
I studied harder.
She listened better. She listened better.
Ella escuchó mejor.
She listened better.
She listened better.
He cooked faster. He cooked faster.
Él cocinó más rápido.
He cooked faster.
He cooked faster.
We danced lightly. We danced lightly.
Bailamos con ligereza.
We danced lightly.
We danced lightly.
They helped gladly. They helped gladly.
Ellos ayudaron con gusto.
They helped gladly.
They helped gladly.
I waited longer. I waited longer.
Esperé más tiempo.
I waited longer.
I waited longer.
She stopped suddenly. She stopped suddenly.
Ella se detuvo de repente.
She stopped suddenly.
She stopped suddenly.
He smiled brightly. He smiled brightly.
Él sonrió brillantemente.
He smiled brightly.
He smiled brightly.
We hugged closely. We hugged closely.
Abrazamos de cerca.
We hugged closely.
We hugged closely.
They traveled safely. They traveled safely.
Viajaron seguros.
They traveled safely.
They traveled safely.
I walked farther. I walked farther.
Caminé más lejos.
I walked farther.
I walked farther.
She sang softly. She sang softly.
Ella cantó suavemente.
She sang softly.
She sang softly.
He painted slowly. He painted slowly.
Él pintó despacio.
He painted slowly.
He painted slowly.
We listened carefully. We listened carefully.
Escuchamos atentamente.
We listened carefully.
We listened carefully.
They worked harder. They worked harder.
Trabajaron más duro.
They worked harder.
They worked harder.
I improved greatly. I improved greatly.
Mejoré mucho.
I improved greatly.
I improved greatly.
She tried harder. She tried harder.
Ella intentó más fuerte.
She tried harder.
She tried harder.
He waited calmly. He waited calmly.
Él esperó con calma.
He waited calmly.
He waited calmly.
We helped openly. We helped openly.
Ayudamos abiertamente.
We helped openly.
We helped openly.
They danced well. They danced well.
Bailaron bien.
They danced well.
They danced well.
I observed closely. I observed closely.
Observé de cerca.
I observed closely.
I observed closely.
She explained carefully. She explained carefully.
Ella explicó cuidadosamente.
She explained carefully.
She explained carefully.
He arrived quickly. He arrived quickly.
Él llegó rápido.
He arrived quickly.
He arrived quickly.
We stayed nearby. We stayed nearby.
Nos quedamos cerca.
We stayed nearby.
We stayed nearby.
They listened quietly. They listened quietly.
Escucharon en silencio.
They listened quietly.
They listened quietly.
I smiled warmly. I smiled warmly.
Sonreí calurosamente.
I smiled warmly.
I smiled warmly.
She danced beautifully. She danced beautifully.
Ella bailó hermosamente.
She danced beautifully.
She danced beautifully.
He helped kindly. He helped kindly.
Él ayudó amablemente.
He helped kindly.
He helped kindly.
We worked harder. We worked harder.
Trabajamos más duro.
We worked harder.
We worked harder.
They cooked better. They cooked better.
Cocinaron mejor.
They cooked better.
They cooked better.
I studied deeply. I studied deeply.
Estudié profundamente.
I studied deeply.
I studied deeply.
She hugged gently. She hugged gently.
Ella abrazó gentilmente.
She hugged gently.
She hugged gently.
He laughed softly. He laughed softly.
Él rió suavemente.
He laughed softly.
He laughed softly.
We observed thoroughly. We observed thoroughly.
Observamos detenidamente.
We observed thoroughly.
We observed thoroughly.
They improved quickly. They improved quickly.
Ellos mejoraron rápido.
They improved quickly.
They improved quickly.
I waited longer. I waited longer.
Esperé más tiempo.
I waited longer.
I waited longer.
She explained clearly. She explained clearly.
Ella explicó claramente.
She explained clearly.
She explained clearly.
He cooked faster. He cooked faster.
Él cocinó más rápido.
He cooked faster.
He cooked faster.
We helped kindly. We helped kindly.
Ayudamos amablemente.
We helped kindly.
We helped kindly.
They danced softly. They danced softly.
Bailaron suavemente.
They danced softly.
They danced softly.
I cleaned thoroughly. I cleaned thoroughly.
Limpié completamente.
I cleaned thoroughly.
I cleaned thoroughly.
She listened attentively. She listened attentively.
Ella escuchó atentamente.
She listened attentively.
She listened attentively.
He hugged warmly. He hugged warmly.
Él abrazó calurosamente.
He hugged warmly.
He hugged warmly.
We waited patiently. We waited patiently.
Esperamos pacientemente.
We waited patiently.
We waited patiently.
They smiled brightly. They smiled brightly.
Ellos sonrieron brillantemente.
They smiled brightly.
They smiled brightly.
I cooked quickly. I cooked quickly.
Cociné rápido.
I cooked quickly.
I cooked quickly.
She explained carefully. She explained carefully.
Ella explicó cuidadosamente.
She explained carefully.
She explained carefully.
He improved slowly. He improved slowly.
Él mejoró lentamente.
He improved slowly.
He improved slowly.
We observed quietly. We observed quietly.
Observamos en silencio.
We observed quietly.
We observed quietly.
They worked harder. They worked harder.
Trabajaron más duro.
They worked harder.
They worked harder.
I traveled farther. I traveled farther.
Viajé más lejos.
I traveled farther.
I traveled farther.
She cared deeply. She cared deeply.
Ella se preocupó profundamente.
She cared deeply.
She cared deeply.
He smiled gently. He smiled gently.
Él sonrió gentilmente.
He smiled gently.
He smiled gently.
We worked harder. We worked harder.
Trabajamos más duro.
We worked harder.
We worked harder.
They danced together. They danced together.
Bailaron juntos.
They danced together.
They danced together.
I traveled widely. I traveled widely.
Viajé mucho.
I traveled widely.
I traveled widely.
She improved greatly. She improved greatly.
Ella mejoró mucho.
She improved greatly.
She improved greatly.
He hugged warmly. He hugged warmly.
Él abrazó calurosamente.
He hugged warmly.
He hugged warmly.
We walked slowly. We walked slowly.
Caminamos despacio.
We walked slowly.
We walked slowly.
They traveled farther. They traveled farther.
Viajaron más lejos.
They traveled farther.
They traveled farther.
I cleaned properly. I cleaned properly.
Limpié correctamente.
I cleaned properly.
I cleaned properly.
She explained briefly. She explained briefly.
Ella explicó brevemente.
She explained briefly.
She explained briefly.
He smiled brightly. He smiled brightly.
Él sonrió brillantemente.
He smiled brightly.
He smiled brightly.
We worked early. We worked early.
Trabajamos temprano.
We worked early.
We worked early.
They stayed briefly. They stayed briefly.
Ellos se quedaron brevemente.
They stayed briefly.
They stayed briefly.